Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this evening's event with Michael Klein and Mark Matousek, Mystery of the Absent Father. It's being offered to celebrate the publication of a new edition of The Boy He Left Behind, A Man's Search for His Lost Father, Mark's 2000 memoir. My name is Jason Cobley, and I will be your host. Before we start, let me tell you a little bit about what to expect during tonight's event. Michael and Mark will speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open the lines for your questions. Instructions for asking questions. If you have any comments or questions during their talk, please do go ahead and type them into the chat box, and we'll get to them once the dialogue is over and Q&A begins. Finally, if you'd like to purchase a copy of The Boy He Left Behind, we'll be posting a 20% discount code at the end of the call. Now, let me go ahead and introduce you to our speakers. Michael Klein is a 5-time Lambda Book Award finalist and 2-time winner in poetry. He has published 2 memoirs, Track Conditions and The End of Being Known, as well as numerous books and articles. His essays have appeared in a variety of publications, including Poetry Magazine, Poets and Writers, Tin House, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. His new book, The Early Minutes of Without, Poems Selected and New, will be released on October 1st, which was yesterday, and he is currently at work on a book of true crime called The Beat Field. Mark Matousek is an award-winning teacher, speaker, and the author of 8 books, including Sex, Death, Enlightenment, A True Story, When You're Falling, Writing to Awaken, and most recently, Lessons from an American Stoic, How Emerson Can Change Your Life. A featured blogger for PsychologyToday.com, he has contributed to numerous anthologies and publications, including The New Yorker and the Oprah magazine, Harper's Bazaar, and he's the founder of the Seekers Forum, a global community for non-sectarian spiritual dialogue. Mark offers workshops internationally using his Writing to Awaken method. Without further ado, let's welcome Mark and Michael.
Hey, Jay, it's good to see you.
You too, sir.
And Michael is here somewhere, Michael Klein.
I am here somewhere.
There you are.
There you are.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Great. I'm excited about this evening. It's amazing when a memoir, 23-year-old memoir comes out, your life literally flashes in front of your eyes. So I'm excited about the new edition and looking forward to exploring fatherlessness with you, Michael.
Yeah, you too. And it's so funny because I'm glad you reminded me, among others. I mean, it's the first time I'm hearing that this was originally published 20 years ago, basically, or almost 20 years ago, right? 23 years ago. So, which I did not know. It really didn't feel that old to me. So I'm really glad that it's back in the world. And it's back in a different world, right? I mean, that's a long time. What made you decide? Well, first of all, what prompted you? What gave you the idea initially? And then what gave you the idea for this new, emergence of the book?
Originally, it happened by serendipity. I had never thought of looking for my father. I grew up with this family myth that he was a bastard. He was not the kind of father I would have wanted. I wasn't the kind of son that he would have wanted. And I completely bought into this myth until I was in my late 30s and I was having lunch with somebody and he was asking me about my family. And I started talking about my mother and my father. And when I did that, his face dropped. And he said, well, why haven't you looked for him? I said, well, I gave him all the reasons that I had always been told why I wouldn't want to know this person. And my friend just wasn't convinced. He called, bullshit on it, and he kind of dared me to do it. And weirdly enough, that became the impetus for hiring a detective and finally kind of wanting to close this chapter of my life. For me, it was never about finding the man, that person. It was about admitting that it mattered and that his leaving had really impacted me. And I had just never, it was so deep and really painful for me that I never let myself admit that. So for me, I was really aware while the detective was looking for him that it wasn't about wanting to necessarily connect with that human being so much as thinking about what father means and being willing to feel the absence of it, which is something that I had never really let myself do.
Did you think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, did you feel like when you got the idea, when it was triggered for you from your friend Joe Dolce, right? Did you feel, and you got a detective, and so it became this real kind of puzzle that you really, an exploration like that had, like you said, a lot more than just finding your father. I mean, this was like, who hires a private detective, right, for something like that? I mean, it's an unusual move, I think. But the thing I want to ask you is, did you feel before Joe had given you the impulse, things that were missing in your psyche that you could identify directly had to do with your father?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why it hit me so hard when he said that, because I was aware of things missing in my own masculinity, in my own understanding of myself as a man. You know, it's when a parent disappears, it's like half of you goes with them. And I always felt like I was half a phantom, that there was half of me missing. And I never realized until I opened this can of worms that it really was all about this man and not having a father means in terms of connecting to the world and understanding yourself. I grew up in a house full of women. I loved them, but they were crazy. I had 3 sisters and my mom. We lived in a very small apartment. And I used to think it's kind of like a sperm swimming around its huge egg. That's how I felt. I felt like I was this sperm that was swimming around this huge ovum, unable to really get in. And so I was always an outsider. I always felt that there was something missing in me. And so when I started to look for my dad, I realized how much of it lined up with the kinds of lessons that you might get from a father who was paying attention.
Right. And what's so striking to me, and I'm sure that for a lot of people, you know, and it's like on the first beat of the book, you literally see him. He comes to kidnap you, and then you see him drive away. And all I could think of was, I told you this before about Shane. You know, Shane, come back, Shane. It's really that moment. It's real, but which is so much different than, say, a father who is absent, but you know, ambiguous, like you don't even know where he is. Like he's not a physical being, really. He's an idea, right? But for you to see the father, literally, it's the metaphor of all metaphors, right? Driving away out of your life, never to return. And then, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead to give it away, but I hope people have read the book. But at the end, when you don't, can you talk about the end? Because it's really amazing.
Sure.
Where you find somebody named Jim Matousek.
Yeah, I do. And I don't end up finding my father. I find this broken down old man in Pasadena who lined up all the criteria were there. He was absolutely going to be my dad. Joe, the detective, was sure of it. And I sat outside. I'll never forget it. It was pouring rain. I sat outside, waiting, kind of catching my breath. And I went to the door, and this old guy in a t-shirt opens the door. And it's obviously not my father, because I had seen.
And you say in the book, you literally say the sentence, I knew it was not my father. Like looking at him, this was not.
There was no question. Also, I mean, we had one picture of my dad. It was a sort of a distant photo of my father. So I knew he wasn't my dad. And he listened to my story with so much pity in his eyes. And he was really saying, I wish I were your father. I wish I could help you with this. But for me, what I needed to do was take the journey. It really wasn't about where it led me. And I had this grief afterward, this kind of explosion of grief when I finally got back in the car, and I just sat there, and I felt like a lifetime of longing that I hadn't been aware of was just pouring out of me. I didn't know that it was there. And it was covering over a lot of what I understood about myself as a man and about masculinity. I realized that I needed to father myself.
Right.
And I had been doing it kind of unconsciously, but I realized when that door is finally closed and you see this guy's never going to show up, it is a transition.
Yeah.
It was different afterward.
Sure. And you bring up the masculinity, which again, because of the time that's passed, has a whole new, there are new adjectives to be applied, like toxic. I don't think was around in the 2000, possibly. But what about that? What is your definition? What was your definition of masculinity before? And then what did it become after the journey?
I realized that my definition of masculinity was very grandiose. In the absence of there being actual life-size role models, I had built masculinity and what being a man means up to a really oversized degree. I used to think about the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the seven wonders of the world, standing sort of astride the bay there. And I thought that being a man was brought that kind of strength. And that kind of power. And I aspired to that. Of course, it's completely ridiculous and unrealistic, but I didn't have anything else to imitate. So I was just trying to be as powerful as I could be. And I made a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of times when I was toxic in my masculinity that I wasn't aware of. It's just that I didn't know how to modulate it. I didn't have a sense of masculinity as containing the feminine. Because I had been so surrounded by the feminine when I was growing up that I had drawn divisions, too clear-cut divisions, and I had really cut off parts of myself. So, for example, I was afraid of my own feminine nature. There were ways that I wasn't comfortable with my emotions, even though I'm a deeply emotional person. I wasn't comfortable with it. So I had spent my life trying to kind of cut off the parts of me that I didn't know what to do with. Yeah. And that's what we all do. That's what the psychological shadow is about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It made me want to hear you read, if you don't mind. There are two things in the book that I love, just for the pure writing. I mean, the story, of course, is the story, but the way it's so beautifully written and so it's inspired by its own ability to sort of jump around a lot. Like you go back and forth in time, which is really great. But the two chapters, the one chapter about how you imagine conception, what happens when people are conceiving, and also the when you talk about the women, the quality of having that many women around you.
Oh, sure.
One of them is chapter 9. That's the one about conception, I believe.
Well, why don't I read that one first, and you can give me the page. Give me the page of the other one.
Okay, I will. Okay.
So this is me trying to kind of feel my way back in memory to who that person was, who my parents were as a couple, and how I sort of came into being. Try to imagine your own conception. Conjure the primal scene in your mind, your parents' bodies thrashing together, your mother's hands, the hands that served dinner, held yours at the sidewalk, dabbed your forehead with Vicks in the winter, clutching at your father's hips as he heaves and grinds and moans above her. Imagine being shot into life as their bodies finally convulse together, the homunculus, the nub of you, snaking its way through utter darkness till it punctures the stupendous ovum. Imagine your parents lying there afterwards, your father's face flushed as he watches your mother, wondering where she retreated to so often, the woman place where he can't find her. Does she already know that you've entered her life, or has she drifted somewhere else? Have you ever wondered what she was thinking at the moment you first took root inside her, and whether your mother's hazy thoughts might have been your first musings too? Whether her mood and your father's as well, the smell of the room, the measure of light, their histories, hopes, and true intentions, the wealth or lack of love between them, the dreams they shared or would never share, might have affected the seed being planted and the shape of what you became? How can we know when memory begins? Can we be sure we're not already present at the moment of our conception? Not physically, of course, but in retrospect, through alchemy and imagination, The stories were told about how we were made and how the people and who the people were who made us. So that was me trying to feel my way into this mystery.
Yeah, it's such beautiful writing. I mean, and original. I mean, it's just fantastic. What a great assignment too. I'm thinking from a teacher point of view to write it. I mean, who does that? It's unusual. Your page number for the second reading is what the hell? 64.
64.
Yeah, chapter 14.
Okay.
I
64.
have animals in the room. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no worries. No worries. And I'll just read a paragraph of this.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay.
Oh, tell me which section you want me to read.
No, they're very beginning the chapter. We were men in a foreign country. If men were in a foreign country.
If men were a foreign country after my father left, then naked men were its jungle interior, full of primitive, frightening forces, fierce and carnivorous. Between the ages of 7 and 12, this territory mesmerized me in an anthropological way for being so alien and taboo. Female bodies were less intriguing. They were everywhere I turned in all their cloven intimacy. Our home was like a child's circus of bouncing breasts and hairless buttocks, robes parted sloppily over breakfast, brown nipples, pink nipples, underarm nubs. There were narrow shoulders, jiggling biceps, high-arched feet, and punctured lobes, eyelids scrubbed red with cold cream, pentimento of liner and shadow, hairspray fumes and douches and powders, menstrual accoutrements and underthings hanging from knob and nozzle, girdles and panties, brassieres and hose, the packing and wrappers of female flesh. So I love women, and I deeply appreciate women's bodies. And I can tell you,
what is it? Pentimento of mascara and
liner. Yeah. But I can also tell you that for a boy growing up surrounded by nothing but femaleness, it was very overwhelming.
Well, as I told you, my friend Ricky Ian Gordon, who's a composer, that's his story. He had 3 sisters, and it was exactly the same thing. And he turned out to be a great artist too, actually, which is interesting. Anyway, I did want to ask you, Mark, if I may, about how, I mean, obviously it's, like I said, it's a different world than it was then. But more importantly, in terms of like, and talking about your book specifically, because one of the things I felt, and I told you this, that, my father's story is not something that I've ever thought about. I've never thought about, I mean, he's dead, but there was a time, most of my life, he was not there, right? I never had that impulse or the inspiration or whatever that you had to do that. And which makes me think of the question. And I know that there were things that you knew that were missing because of the father not being there, but do you think that that you really have to take the journey, that you have to be proactive about it in order to really know whether that is in fact the issue? Or do you live in this nebula, because if you don't, then you always live the way you always lived, right? So whatever happens, and it's like for you, what happened is because you didn't find him, the real Jim, right? The guy who you did find had empathy, which made me think that he was probably in the same position you were. He probably didn't know where his father was either. So there's this incredible, and I'm rambling, please forgive me. And I'm trying to get back to the question, but my question has to do with making the journey as opposed to thinking about making the journey. And maybe the answer is obvious, but it seems to me that there are other people like me, and of course people like you, that are opposite, that don't feel the same way.
Yeah. Honestly, for me, it was about admitting that it hurt. That was the piece I couldn't do. So the real journey for me was from denial and resistance and numbness to truthfulness about everything that had been lost. That was the real journey to me. The external journey, looking for him with the detective, was a great story, but it wasn't what was moving me.
Yeah.
In fact, what happened during this process was that I got to know my mother much better.
Yeah.
I didn't find my father, but my mom and I got much closer. She was much more honest with me. At first, she was dead set against us doing this. but eventually she started to crack. And my mother, it was not an easy nut to crack,
Right.
but she started to crack. She started to soften. The mask started to drop, and she told me something that was really significant that she had never let me know before, and that is that the reason my father left, she had left that out somehow, was that she was having an affair with someone else, and he had walked in on them in a motel together. She managed to leave that small detail out of the narrative, so all the blame went to my dad. And she never owned up to that until late in her life, until I was doing this, doing this search looking for him. So that was a fantastic thing for me, because, and she said, "Oh, your father was a sensitive man. He was too sensitive for me." And so that kind of thing, just the smallest little details, started to fill in a picture of a guy who was lost and very damaged.
Yeah.
And he did bad things, and he was a compulsive liar. I'm not excusing that, but he was also dealing with my mother,
Right.
who was quite a hard human being in many ways. She didn't like soft men.
Right.
So my dad may have had a softness to him that she just couldn't tolerate.
Right. You know, it's interesting what you're saying is also sort of reminds me of the function of the memoir, and particularly with this memoir, where you're thinking you're writing about something, the story of the journey of the father, and in fact, the mother insinuates herself in the story. And it reminds, like Roland Barthes' book, Camera Lucida, is a book that's ostensibly about photography, but it's really a meditation on his mother. And Catherine Harrison's The Kiss is ostensibly about a relationship with her father, but it's really about the mother. Yeah. Speaking of the mother, what did that feel like? That discovery that in fact this is about her too.
Well, at first I felt like I was betraying her. She made it seem like looking for him was a betrayal of her. Didn't I trust her? Didn't I believe her? There was some manipulation.
Yeah.
But when the picture started to widen and fill in, I had more empathy for both of them. I saw that my mother was actually someone who was trapped. She was in love with another man through both of her marriages, the love of her life. She wasn't just sleeping with someone. She was sleeping with the man her parents wouldn't let her marry. So it gave me a deeper empathy for her, and a deeper empathy for him, because he inherited this divorcee with 2 kids. Then he has this little son he didn't know what to do with, and he flew the coop. He couldn't cope. So I looking at it I started to look at it through adult eyes. That's really what happened. It wasn't through the wounded child's eyes, which is how I had always seen it. And I had tried so hard, Michael, not to be a victim, that I denied all of that vulnerability.
That's a really interesting point about the wounded eye thing. I think that's fascinating. And that it took you to when it took you, right, to understand that. Yeah. I guess, I didn't really ask you this, but or maybe I didn't even answer it. I'm wondering about the re-release and what it was like. I mean, a way into that would be like, how did it feel to read the book again? Like last year. I don't know when you read it again. If you read it, maybe you didn't read it again. But what was that like? The difference, in years between now and then.
It's a strange thing being a memoir writer, and this, and you go back to books you wrote decades ago. I'm not that person now. There are things in this book I would never write today. There are things in my first memoir, Sex and Enlightenment, you couldn't pay me to put down in writing again. But, you get more reticent as you get older. And for me, at least, I'm less interested in my story than I used to be. I was a lot more fascinated with the myth of me, 23 years ago than I am now. So it's kind of hard. You read it with some compassion for yourself. And there are passages like the one I just read that I actually still like. But it feels like reading somebody else's story. It doesn't feel like reading your own. And that reminds me of something that someone said to me when I was writing my first memoir. I was so concerned that I was going to be self-absorbed and narcissistic. And she said, you have to remember that when people read your story, they're not reading about you, they're reading about themselves. And I really saw that when I was looking back at this memoir, because I was reading it as who I am now and applying it to who I am now. And that it's an artifact
Yeah.
from the past. And there's a new preface to it, so
Yeah.
it's not entirely old news.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's a timeless subject. The thing that
Yeah.
gives me that the reason I wanted to do it, and I'm happy that it's out again. This is a timeless subject, and this is a huge epidemic. This epidemic of fatherlessness and of the absent father, whether the man himself was in the house or not.
Yeah.
A lot of people I know who grew up with fathers in the home had no emotional connection with their fathers whatsoever, nor did they feel their own father's emotional presence in the
Yeah.
home. And so
Yeah.
that's a problem that a lot of us are coping with, whether we were abandoned, literally abandoned or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reminds me too. I was talking to somebody the other day about who's doing this amazing project. And she had to interview a lot of therapists and stuff. And every single person that she talked to said the major epidemic that's facing people today in this country is loneliness,
Yeah.
of which this is a brand of, right?
It
This
is.
a kind of loneliness, a kind of longing.
Yeah.
Of course, precipitated by the pandemic, but I think this is right up there.
It is. It is. And it's not just for men. I mean, a lot of the women I know go
it's
through
also
their lives.
look around you. Women are around you again. It's also
But the longing for the father, the longing for the absent father, the unattainable father, the one who's going to bless you and give you permission to enter the world. What fathers do traditionally is provide entree to the larger world.
right.
So the mother, you could say, sort of takes care of the nuclear, takes care of the inside, and the father helps you move outside.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of women who have tremendous problems with not only with moving into the world, but with men and trusting their relationships with men.
Right.
And so I wanted this book not only to speak to men, but also to the female longing for father. For example, growing up, my younger sister Belle was much more wounded consciously by not having a dad than I was.
Right.
She's the one, I wish we could find him, or I wish he would come back. I never thought those things. I was too busy focused on the project of me and transcending this kind of swamp of unhappiness that was in the family home. That's all I cared about. I wasn't interested in going down deep into the dark roots of things. I was trying to survive.
Yeah. You mentioned, I just had to mention him because you sort of mentioned him in the book, and I think he's a really important writer for you and for a lot of people. Stanley Kunitz, the poet, who is important particularly in this context because that was the subject of his life.
Yes.
The absent father. It was the subject of his poetry, right?
Yes.
All of his poems were about the fact that his father had committed suicide. And those poems about his father are just extraordinary.
Yes.
And there aren't a lot of them. But then you can feel the shadow in all of them too. I mean, because poets, as people might think, we really don't have a lot of subject matter. It's about three things that poets write about after love and death, right? Or life and death. But anyway, I just thought that was fascinating. And so he must have influenced you to some degree. I mean, how did you feel when you read those poems?
I loved Stanley, and I was introduced to him by our mutual friend Marie Howe. In the last 2 years of his life. And I used to go to his house over on, I think, 11th Street. Oh, yeah. I used to go over and visit with him. And he was just the most extraordinary being.
Yeah, he really was.
So he would talk about how self-reinvention was his philosophy.
Yeah.
And how he didn't wake up as a nonagenarian. He woke up as a poet. Yeah. And then he created each day as a bride, as a new poem, to be encountered. He was a profound inspiration for me.
Yeah.
It was this wound was really the way in for me. This is where I felt most connected to him.
Yeah.
Because it runs all the way through his work, this sense of this shadow of grief and this longing.
Yeah, and even Sharon Olds, to a degree, I would have to say, the poet Sharon Olds has that as a subject. Not necessarily the opposite, but one short thing I have to tell you about Stanley that is really, I mean, this really shows about his mysticism. I actually lived in his apartment when I was a kid before he moved into it. I lived in that building.
Stanley's?
in his apartment that was bought by him. Is that wild?
That is wild.
And the only reason I figured it out was because when I went to see him. I said, "Oh, this is the same building I lived in when I was a kid." And then 2H or whatever the name was, the number was.
That's wild.
It was what? It was so wild that I couldn't tell him. I was terrified of what it meant. Anyway, but I'm glad. I'm so happy to see that, and it made me love the book even more. And I knew you knew this. I didn't know that you actually were that friendly with him, but that makes sense, obviously. I would love it if you. We don't. I don't know. It looks like we don't have a lot of time, but and I guess that's up to Jason. But I would love it if you could read something else, maybe a little bit from the book, or no? You want to talk more?
I'd really like to ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay, so in the last 5 minutes before we open it up, how did your father's situation, complicated as it was, and you don't need to tell the whole story unless you want to, but how did that affect your feelings about yourself as a man, and particularly in relationship, and how you embody your own masculinity?
Yeah. Okay. Now, see, I'm having the same reaction to that question, which I had when I was at times when I was reading a book, which is, I've never thought about this before. This is like really, and when you start thinking about it, it's like, oh, there is actually like heft to that idea, but I would never think of it unless I was asked that question. When you ask me that, I'm thinking, what was it that I thought of as what was masculinity? I was attracted, this is true, and I'm not being highfalutin or metaphorical here. From a very early age, I was desperately attracted to beauty. In whatever form that was, whether it was music, which was probably the first indication of it being in the world, or whatever it was. So I put myself in such a genderless kind of mode. I mean, I did not think of myself particularly masculine or feminine. The only time I thought about it was when people used to make fun of me because I was feminine. But I would never have thought about it until then. And it bothered me because I didn't feel particularly feminine. I didn't feel particularly masculine, if you want to know the truth. I didn't know what, like, because of the beauty, I was really between worlds. It made me feel, and maybe it was because I'm sure in some way it was because I was afraid to deal with my masculinity or my femininity or see myself as a physical being, who didn't take care of them, didn't start taking care of themselves until they were 30 and stopped drinking. I mean, that's the reality of it. And I think when I got sober, and in conversations with other people, and like that moment in your book when you're talking about, all these stories about the absent father come pouring out, after you've done your whole thing. I think that's, affected sort of, how I feel about masculinity now, and it came, and but also because I'm queer, that the idea of masculinity, I've never associated the two things. I didn't think I had to be one way or another, being a gay. Seriously, I never thought. And I actually, to be honest with you, I've never subscribed to anything clone-like or any of that. Like, it always drove me nuts because I wanted to be an artist. That was the other thing, Mark. I wanted to be an artist. I mean, the beauty part had to do with making art. What could I do that was beautiful? And I knew it was art. And the only reason it became poetry was because poetry was short and I could read a ton of it. I only read poetry and plays because I could read all. And the only reason I wanted to be an actor, actually, which the first thing, is that masculine or feminine? I didn't know, but it was because of the words that they got to say in a play. It wasn't because I saw a performance, right? So everything was really about reading and literature, and from a very early age. And the only time that I felt like I should make it, how do I feel about my own masculinity, was when, I was incest. My stepfather, there was an incestuous thing going on there. And that was traumatic. And I won't go into it, but that was the moment. And I was 15 when that happened, right? But that was the moment that I thought, oh, if that's masculine, or if that's, I thought of it as a gender thing beyond the fact that it was, verboten and all that stuff. So, and I also became aware of my body. I mean, I think you have to be aware of the body that you're in to know whether masculinity is missing or not there or whatever. You know what I mean? And again, because of the beauty, I wasn't thinking like, it's only when I started like getting really fat that no, seriously. I mean, I don't know. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm talking way too long, but I also feel like I'm jumping the gun here. But it's a really good question. I mean, I really had to think about it. You've really kind of like, this is like, now I feel like you're being Joe Dolce and I'm being you. Like, oh no, now I have to go. Who's dead? But it doesn't even matter. I mean, I think that's an important thing too. It doesn't matter whether they're living or dead. I mean, right?
No.
And it's the journey.
It's understanding how it affected your feelings about power. That's another essential thing.
That I'm very aware of.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I hated it from a very early age.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I hated people who were in power.
Right.
I mean, I just did. I mean, it didn't matter whether they were right or left or sideways. I just hated that one person had power over somebody else.
But your own power, that's what I mean.
My own power was I felt like I either have to use it or it was completely gone. Like I felt powerless. I mean, that's and part of my getting sober had to do with powerlessness too, which I wasn't even aware of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Powerlessness is to me a way of looking at masculinity too, now that I think of it. That, like you said, the father's job is, the mother is the nurturer and the father is to, lead you into the briefcase world or whatever world he decides to move. And that was it too. I never wanted to work for a living, and men worked. No, thank you.
No, thank you.
I didn't know anyone except my mother. This was a cool thing. My mother was in publishing when I was like, her whole life, most of her life. And and so when I was younger, and which is why there's so many books in the house, but that was like a really cool thing that she was working. I thought, oh, I just loved it because I loved her more than anybody else in the house, and she loved it. She loved to work. She loved being out of the house. I can see why. It was a fucking nut house like yours, except I didn't have a lot of people. I had a twin. Mm-hmm. That was all I had. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, good. This is great. I was just curious about how you felt like it affected you, and if and your attitude to your own power and empowerment and sense of agency. Because I realized that my sense of agency was wobbly.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And I would overcompensate because of it was insecure. I would overcompensate.
Yeah.
And try to be, bigger than big and stronger than strong. And all that had to come crashing down.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, when I think of it, there was obviously something to do with whether it was masculine, feminine, but, the powerlessness also had to do with the fact that, I mean, I didn't know who I was for such a long time. I mean, I knew truly at my core. I knew about beauty and I knew about that I wanted to write poetry, but that was it. But that doesn't mean that I knew who I was because I was using those things to be who I was. And you do that as an artist, but it didn't feel that way. It really felt like it was because I didn't know any better. Like maybe I should get a job, or I mean, I ended up, of course, getting. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like I just wanted to be surrounded by beauty. I was absorbed by it. Mm-hmm. I just felt totally absorbed by it. And then, of course, there's trauma happens, and guess what? There's terror too. Terror and beauty, as Rilke would love to say.
Yes, as the great Rilke. And that's of course why we write Memoir, to find out, to ask this question: who am I? Who am I really?
Yeah.
What's this character that I've created?
Rilke has this great line that was translated by Franz Wright. It's a boy in heaven, and it's like our town. He's looking down onto earth, and he says he sees his mother, and he says, "And mother, who was the dog really?"
Right.
And that great story that Sean Penn told about the newborn that came home and the sister who was, was kind of jealous of the baby, and they put a speaker or a microphone in the, like mothers do with the crib, and they hear the older daughter leaning over the crib saying to the baby, "Tell me about God. I'm starting to forget."
It's amazing.
It's like Sean Penn. I fell in love with Sean Penn.
That's wild. That's wild.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
This is what happens with beauty. See, that's what I loved about it.
Mm.
That is live. That is life to me. It's not, and
Mm.
I'm so glad. I'm not going to go there. We could have another conversation. I was going to go into sex, but I won't do that.
Next time. For now, why don't we, Jay? Why don't we open up the lines and have some conversation and see if folks have any questions?
Thank you both, Michael and Mark. Wow, what a wonderful conversation. Yes, now it's your turn. We have a nice group of folks I know on this session. So if you've got a question or comment, we just ask if you could raise your hand virtually. And for any of those that might need a quick refresher, on your display bar, which could be at the top or bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions with a little smiley face. If you click that and just click raise hand, I will go ahead and unmute your line and welcome you into the session. And if you prefer to use the chat box, please do type there and I'll go ahead and relay that for you. But let's go ahead and start with Roberta. Hello, Roberta.
Hi, Jay. Hello, Mark and everyone. Michael, thank you so much. What an interview. I'm kind of like, whoa. It's just like coming at me. I'm wondering if you could have asked for your fathers to have a different behavior than to perhaps have left, have run, have made it, just given it up. What would that behavior be? I mean, I'm asking this to come from your heart. I'm not asking, can you think of another idea that they might have decided upon, but from your heart, what other behavior have you ever thought about? Why didn't they do this?
I mean, I'll go first. I mean, to me, Roberta, knowing what I know about him and knowing what I know about my mother's limitations, I know that there was no other possibility. So it's pure speculation. What if I could have had anything? I wouldn't have wanted him in the house because there was no love there between them. What I would have liked is some sense that he was thinking about me, that I was on his radar, that he knew I had been born, that this picture of us together, of him holding me, meant something to him. That really is all I wanted, was a feeling of having left some mark on him, as opposed to just being kind of spit out and then moving on. So that's really all I wanted. Knowing what I know, that's all that might have been possible. But it certainly wasn't having him come back. And I certainly am glad in retrospect that he didn't take me, because things turned out to be, such that would have been an even bigger disaster. But I would have liked to know that he remembered me.
So I'm just wondering, given your mother's fear of coming fully about what really went down, do you think that might have been possible that your dad did try in some way write or communicate in some way to speak, given that he seems like he's got a lot of you? There's a lot of you in your dad, and you being the writer. I'm just thinking, what if he sent letters and they just never showed up? Because you know what I mean?
It's a good idea for a novel, I mean, yeah, maybe. And it's funny, when I was growing up, whenever I did things my mom didn't like, it was always, "You're just like your father," and then so everything that associated with him, in me that was threatening to her, she kind of blamed on him. So I think actually he and I were quite a lot alike. And the picture I've seen, we have very similar faces. And I never felt like I looked like my mother or took after her in much of any way at all. But what about you, Michael? How would you respond to that? To what do you wish your father had told you or given you? Or
Very much the same thing. That one thing that you had mentioned, which was about thinking about you. I wish he had thought about me and Roulette. I mean, but I was in a very particular situation. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. The thing with my father was that my stepfather legally adopted me when I was 12 or 13. My parents had been divorced. My father, there was a stipulation in the adoption that my real biological father not be in touch with me ever. And then I was 13, and that really set off an alarm, right? I mean, it was like killing somebody. I mean, whatever I felt about him, right? And then when my mother died in 1977, the first thing I did was find him. He was in Dusseldorf, Germany, West Germany. But I saw him. I went to see him. Oh, but I wish, yes, I remember telling him when I saw him, why didn't you ever write me a letter or find out? Like, why did you stick to the stipulation? You're not going to go to jail, for God's sake. I mean, come on. And we had a very adult conversation, actually. It turns out that I didn't like him very much, unfortunately. I mean, I had to get to know him, and I really didn't like him very much. And the stuff in me that I see that is somewhat similar is everything about me that feels superficial or putting on a mask, not being myself. Every moment where I feel like I'm not myself, I feel like my father. Because he was
that's a story. That's something.
I know, it's true though. My godmother described him as somebody, he was very dashing. And the way that he was described was that he made a great first impression and there wasn't a second one.
Right.
And I don't feel like that much, but there are occasions when I feel like that.
Right. Thanks, Roberta.
Thank you.
Good question.
And before we get to Janice and then Nikki, I'm going to read just from chat from Gina. She asks a question. Besides being an entree to the outer world for both sons and daughters, what else is there to say about the role of a father that is unique to their girl child and the wounds that come from an emotionally missing father?
To me, it's what a father can do in a healthy relationship with a daughter is mirror what healthy masculinity looks like, and what with the mother, the child can see in their relationship what a balanced and loving relationship looks like between a man and woman. If you don't have any sense of what that looks like, I know that's a big handicap for a lot of women later in life, looking at, trying to have relationships and having no sense of how you do that with a real live biological man, for example. And that's something that's something that parents give to their kids. But what a father can do is show, there's a beautiful saying, the tenderness of wolves. It's this sense with a man that the strength is there, the power is there, even the aggression is there, but it's being held in check by love. And it's being held in check by presence. And for a woman for a girl to be exposed to that and have a sense of what that strength is like, I think later in life, maleness may not be quite as threatening. And so I love this idea of the tenderness of wolves, and that men can reflect that to their daughters, so the girls can feel safe and even heartened by male strength and male power, instead of feeling it to be a threat to them or some danger.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add to that?
No, actually.
Okay. Thank you for that question. And let's go to Janice. Hello, Janice.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Janice. Nice to see you.
You too. Rainy here in Vancouver. And hi, everybody. Thank you for doing this. So I realized that, I've thought much, much more about my relationship with my mother than my relationship with my father. And so when my father died, 5-6 years ago, I didn't feel grief. And, oh, by the way, my father's given name was Wolf. But it was anglicized to William, and that's, he was known as Bill. but I always liked his name as Wolf. So when he died, and still to this day, I don't feel like, if I feel anything, I feel the grief of the father I didn't have. And, growing up in the 50s and 60s, that was so behaviorist, and that there was not a strong emotional connection or emotional availability. And so I'm wondering about, have you grieved the father that you didn't have?
I have. And when I was just talking to Michael about what happened for me in the car after I said goodbye to this old guy who was not my dad, that's what it was. It was grief. It was grief. It was years and years of grief that I had never let myself feel. It just came spewing out of me. I was shocked. Have you had that experience, Janice, where you're not even sure you're feeling something and the next minute you're in tears? And it shows you how compartmentalized the mind is. I didn't know how sad I was, and that the whole story was closed. I didn't realize that, and the grief was profound for me, and it woke me up, and it gave me, it was comforting to feel the love for this person who was never there, the desire, the longing. It was grounding for me. I felt like I was in my body, instead of it being some phantom limb, off there somewhere that you can kind of feel, but it's not really attached to you. Suddenly I felt very grounded in that moment of realizing this is never going to happen, and letting go.
Thank you. So that opens up a possibility.
Good. Nice to see you, Janice. Thank you.
Too.
Thank you, Janice. And we'll go to Nikki. And just before that, Shelley asks, Mark, you don't mention your grandfather's masculine influence, and why?
There wasn't much masculine influence from my grandfather. He was not someone who showed his heart much. He was a very distant person. He was an angry person. I didn't feel deeply bonded to him. He turned me off to Judaism, for example. He was everything I didn't want to be. And he was a very pious Orthodox Jew who had trouble being generous with the people he loved. So to me, he represented hypocrisy in a way. And he was a very wounded guy. I have compassion for him, but I didn't feel any kind of maleness from him. He never made any effort to be my role model in any way. He didn't know what to do with me, frankly. So we were polite. We kept our distance from each other. My mother loathed him, and so that didn't help. So if I had any kind of relationship with him, it would have felt like she might have felt like I was betraying her in some way. But it wasn't a strong relationship.
Thank you. And let's connect with Nikki. Hello, Nikki.
Hello. Thank you.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi. Thank you both for sharing this. This is really vulnerable. And I'm thinking about so many things, including like when I'm with other women, sometimes the contempt of which they talk about their husbands a little bit. It's a little jokey, but it's there. And I'm thinking about both of your experiences and my own, kind of like what you said about writing a memoir. We're reading about ourselves as well as learning about your own story. So my father died when I was 9 very suddenly, and my mom got remarried, and then my stepfather suicided when I was 12. So by the time I was entering adolescence, I had, not knowingly, but so much besides grief. But what you described is like, how does a young girl understand men and feel safe with them? And I'm so drawn to masculinity and virility. And I'm also so terrified of it because I feel like it can just crush me. And it's something that I'm working with at this stage of my life. But the bigger thing is that the grief opened up a longing that it has sometimes been so profound. And so it led me to my spiritual interest. And I'm wondering if either of you or both of you can talk about your experience of longing and how it might connect to the absence of your fathers.
That's a big question. Do you want to go, Michael? Oh. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a big question.
Maybe too big.
No, it's not too big. There is never a question that's too big. They're all too big. But it's very what I love about it too is that it's really accurate. I mean, I can feel my longing having to do in a sense. I mean, it's of a piece, but it's part of it definitely is a stream of being in my body, being a male, being, you know, when you talked about being, I forgot to mention that I was afraid of men when I was younger too. I mean, a lot. Like I couldn't, like Mark, I couldn't figure them out, particularly if they were naked when I was looking at them. I mean, it was just, I weirdly didn't identify with it. I mean, I knew I looked like that, but it was still very strange. And that could be because I was a twin. So there's longing from the giddy up, right? From the jump street, at a very early age. And I think, you know, David Calstone was a writer who talked about the poet Elizabeth Bishop, and he said about her that she was homesick for a place she had never been. And that's kind of how I felt. I really identified with that. It was like, and that home, and that home is either the father or the mother. I see the home not as a person, as a way of being in the world, right? That's what that home represents. So that longing, I still have that longing. You know, I don't think of it whether it's about the father, but when you mention it, it's like when Mark asked the question, it's like, oh my God, now I'm thinking of it. I never thought about that before, but that's what happens. So it's there. I think it's part of what makes us. I mean, I think it's part of our DNA. Look, that longing for, you know, I mean, the longing of being human. Just being human in this day, particularly now when they're trying to replace us.
Right.
I mean, and I'm serious. The AI stuff when it comes to copyright infringement is horrifying. But I'm not going to go there. But really, I mean, and that's why it's so important now about that. Like, talk about tender as wolves. I mean, we're really at a threshold, and being human has a lot. That's what keeps us human. It's that longing, and it's also the imagination. And how the two need each other in order to live. And really, I'm writing about that. I just think it's so important. And in a way, I think people need to get back. I mean, we all have done things to distract that or not to acknowledge it or whatever it is, right? And it's like Joni Mitchell, man, get back to the garden. I mean, I really feel like that a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm really acting like this because when you said longing, it was like, you know, it was like the universe opened with that word. It feels like that's what being human is. We're waiting. We are longing in our waiting.
Longing for me has been the primary motivation for my life as a seeker. Really, it's wanting to connect, and wanting to bridge this gap, this abyss between the personal self and the rest of creation. And spirituality is the only way I've found of doing. I think it's the only way that we do that is because it gives us a means of penetrating the illusion of separation.
Oh my God, yeah.
If you can't do that, then you live as a fragment. You live alienated throughout your life. So whether it's a longing for the father or home or for the mother, these big existential sources, that energy of longing is great fuel for self-discovery. I know folks who are not seekers, for example, they're not bitten by the bug, and they're often people who had a very happy childhood. It's interesting. They're not trying to heal any big wound. They're not aware of a big void being there. A friend of mine calls it the God-shaped hole. They don't have a God-shaped hole. And I have always had that. My earliest memories were of longing, of a feeling like there was more, and not being able to get to it, and wanting to find a way to it, and sensing that it was in me as well. That longing has been the best fuel.
It's also what makes an artist. It's also the thing that makes an artist. The artist is always searching.
Mhm.
The artist is never satisfied, right?
Right.
I mean, it's all of that, and that's why, getting back to beauty and stuff. But that's why it's so important right now in this to be, you don't have to be an artist. You don't have to create art, but to be aware of its spiritual, power, because it's it's what keeps us. I really believe that. I think it's the culture that keeps us on the ground. It's not politics, and it's not. And this, I'm so happy that you said self-seeking, because that's the key. It's not, you're not supported in that search of longing. It's
No.
all, so you have to reinvent yourself in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, it's like Stanley Kunis said, what makes the engine go? Desire, desire, desire. And to me,
Mhm.
that desire is the desire for the bigger life. It's the desire
Yes.
for spiritual connection. That's what keeps us going. That's why we show up at our desks. That's why we show up on our Zafus, in our yoga classes, whatever it is that connects us to a larger whole. That's the way through. And that's
What does not change is the will to change.
right.
What
Absolutely.
does not change is the will to change.
Right. Exactly.
Thank you. This is such a great conversation.
Thanks, Nikki. It's good to see you.
Great to see you, Mark.
Nice to
Thanks.
see you.
So,
Thank
folks,
you.
we've gone over time, and I want to respect your time. So, Grace, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question today. Jay, could you just pull up? I wanted folks to know that if you'd like to buy The Boy He Left Behind, Monkfish, my publisher, is offering a 20% discount, which is very generous. And this is the link to do so. It will also be in the replay recording that we'll be sending out of this evening's session tomorrow. So you don't have to write it down now, but just know that you can buy the book for 20% off. And I wanted to be able to share that with you. So without keeping you any longer, Jay, thank you as always.
Absolutely. And this was obviously rich with a lot of amazing content from you both. So there may be a part two. We may have to schedule.
And Michael, thank you so much for doing this. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, sweetie. It was great. I love being here.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Take care.